Cool. Anybody have any other questions? Otherwise, we're good. Well, in that case, what do we got? We got homework 4 due November 8th. All right, so we got a few weeks. I'll post that later this week. Lab 2 the week before homework 4. I'm flexible on that one. We'll see. We'll see. Maybe it'll get pushed. But it won't be sooner. It might be later. I have a feeling nobody will be upset if I push that, but we'll talk about it. Exam 2, the title is to be determined, right? But that will be on the 19th, and then homework 5 will be due the Sunday after the exam. All right? So we don't have a whole ton of assignments between now and Thanksgiving, really, right? I was thinking about giving you the guys the exam on Thanksgiving, right? But that seems like a poor taste, so decided against it. Also a joke. I would never do that because then I would. Yeah, in my family, we have the tradition where I make the whole Thanksgiving dinner, and I don't have to watch kids for like 3 hours. So, that's the trade-off. The trade-off. Anyway. Yeah. Danny, that seems like a lot of work. Danny's suggestion is for you. When you're thinking about it, the suggestion was to have multiple. Apparently, Jonah Beaumont have many exams. Good for him. Bully for him. All right. Now is the time, right? So what are we doing today, right? For real this time, we did review exam 1. Now we're into topic 4. We're going to talk about time domain analyses, but this is the setup still. With the rest of this week, we're going to set it up because there's a couple of ways of writing models that are very useful for us when we were talking about time domain analyses, specifically whether we are doing them by hand or, more importantly, with MATLAB or Simulink, right? What does MATLAB and Simulink want? What do most software packages that solve these models, right? What do they want us to use, right? And how do controllers work, essentially, right? Again, we're not going to get into control in this class, right? That's not the point. This is the setup to that. This is the basis for feedback control here, right? All right, so what is the objective here, right? Well, we got multiple, right? We want to solve equations of motion for constants and functions of time when forces and moments are applied. We want to model free and forced responses for mass spring damper systems. Solve for system response using MATLAB. So for those of you who don't typically bring a computer to class, make sure you download MATLAB and you bring your computer to class, right? We're going to do some problems where you're going to want to have MATLAB and Simulink. Not today. In the future. We want to create linear mathematical models from provided algebraic representations, right? Want to model 3-step ramp and impulse responses for a system. Analyze a system response using the time constant and the underdamped natural frequency, or the undamped natural frequency, excuse me. Calculate the time constant and the undamped natural frequency and estimate the values of coefficients in dynamic models using time domain response data. Right? After we're done with this, topic 5 is literally all about Laplace transforms. The next exam is going to focus these two topics, 4 and 5. Okay? All right, we will talk about, and then the final exam will be basically everything that's left, right? Which is frequency domain analysis. Okay? All right. So up to this point, what have we done? All right, we've done literally nothing with step 5. right? Literally that we've done the first 4 steps and then we stop short every time, right? And we're about to change that, but it's not going to change today, right? Today is going to be more setup stuff. Previous chapters focused on the derivation of mathematical models for mechanical, electrical, fluidic, and thermal systems, right? We've seen that chaining multiple systems together results in sets of coupled Diffie cubes, right? Great, so what do we do with them? It's an excellent question, right? But let's pump the brakes for a second. First, we need to discuss the standard forms of representing models. Why? Also a good question. Because the standard forms of dynamic systems will facilitate the solution of system response using either analytical or numerical methods like MATLAB and Simulink, right? So we're going to talk about state variable equations. We're going to talk about state space representation. Next class, we'll get into linearization. We'll talk about I/O equations, even though we've been doing everything as I/O equations since the beginning of class, right? Because that's one of our steps is reduce everything. So it's in terms of my inputs and my outputs only, right? We'll talk about transfer functions and we'll talk about block diagrams. Sean, question? So the question was, are we going to include all the flavors of models in our, I guess, our quest of modeling, right? And the answer is yeah. We should be able to model any and all of these systems, right? So as usual, the starting point of the derivation of a system model is its mathematical model, right? Which is what we've been doing up until this point. And so if you guys were like, I really don't feel comfortable with modeling, but I'm really excited now because the modeling part of the class is over. It's not over. You still need to be able to get the model to do the analysis, right? So this isn't a class where we do it in chunks and you can just forget what happened in the first part, right? This is all building towards something, right? And so you'll still have plenty of opportunity to practice making models, right? You'll see it in the homework, right? The homework will say, write a model and tell me the system response for this type of input, right? A lot of the homework problems, well, not a lot of them, but a smattering of homework problems will have you do it by hand and also check it with MATLAB and Simulink, right? So we're going to get some practice using tools as well. All right, you guys have any questions on this so far? Honestly. No. Everybody all right? Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about state variables. What is a state variable equation? It's one of the methods that we have for representing a system, right? Well, why don't we just use I/O? I'm comfortable with that. That's sweet. Yeah. And there's pros and cons to using input-output equations. Pros and cons using transfer functions, and pros and cons using state space, right? We'll talk about those in future lectures, right? But what are state variables, right? State variables are the set of variables that completely define a system. The number of state variables is equal to n, which is the order of our system, right? So if you have a 10th order system, you need 10 state variables. A state on its own is the smallest set of dynamic variables that completely defines a dynamic system. They're called state variables, usually a physical variable for a system like displacement, velocity, acceleration, voltage, currents, pressure, or temperature, right? So any of the dynamic variables that we've set forth before are typically good uses of state variables. We'll see why a little bit later. If you know the state of a system, then you can quantify, then any quantity can be determined, right? So if you know the state, then you can figure out the energy, you can figure out the momentum, right? But the choice of state variables is not unique. And so multiple there's multiple solutions depending on how you want to define your state variable, right? Now, yeah. Standard convention defines x sub I is equal to 1, 2, 3, all the way to n, right, where I is equal to 1 to n, right, as our state variables, and we call these the dynamic variables, whereas u sub j, where j goes from 1 to n, are my inputs, right? So when I write x, that's going to be my state variables. When I write u, that's going to be my input variables, right? We're going to be talking about this in terms of vector or matrix format in a little bit, right? But not yet, not yet. State variable equations are the basis for state space representation, but they're slightly different. We're going to see why in a second. So here's my state variable equations, right? I've got x1 and x dot 1 is a function of x1, x2 all the way to xn, and u1 all the way to u1, right? So the function of all of my x dot 1 is a function of all of my states and all of my inputs, right? Remember, a dynamic variable or a dynamic system is a system in which the current output depends on all of the inputs, whether they are previous or current, right? And the initial conditions, right? And so we can write as many x dot equations as we need, right? We can create as many dynamic state variables as we need. Right? The right-hand side functions f sub I can either be linear or nonlinear. Right? If the right-hand side of this equation is linear, then we can use state space representation, which is convenient and it's a vector matrix format. Right? Well, before we do that, let's talk about this. Right? So we want to determine the state variable equations for the system modeled by the following ODEs, where Z and W are the dynamic variables and V is the input. Okay. Cool. Very cool. So what are we supposed to do? Well, we know the dynamic variables, right? And our dynamic variables are going to be our state variables. Okay. So let's start off. So just as a note, right? We have the model here already. We're given the two equations, right? That we're dealing with. We're already given the model. In this case, we don't need to derive it. However, that won't be the case all the time, right? All right. So dynamic variables, we're going to associate that with x, right? So I'm going to say that x1 is equal to z, and I'm going to say that x2 is equal to z dot. All right, so that's going to say that x dot 1 is equal to z dot, and x dot 2 is equal to z double dot. I also know, I'll write it here, x3 is equal to w, and x dot 3 is equal to w dot. Right? And we were told that our input was v. V is equal to v. Okay. Why did you do that, Dr. D? Why did you split z? Oh, all right. Sean, question? It's cubed. Is the w cubed or is it triple dot? It's cubed. It should be w dot cubed, right? Because I got equation editor on that one. This should be the dot right there. Sometimes when you're typing things out in equation editor very quickly, it's easy to get things in the wrong box. Right? I apologize. All right. So why did we do it this way? Right? Why? Well, remember, look at our format. We need an expression for x dot 1, x dot 2, all the way to x dot n. Right? That's what we need. So that's why when we wrote this, we look at these equations, right? I've got z is my dynamic variable, but if I take the derivative of that, that only gets me to z dot, right? So I need z dot to actually be a dynamic variable of its own, so I can take the derivative of that and get to z double dot. So what do we do here, right? So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to plug in our state variables into our equations here, right? So I'm going to plug in my state variables. I'll get 2 x dot 2, right? Because z double dot's x2, plus 1.8 times z, and z was x1, minus 0.4 times w, which was x3, plus 0.2 times z dot times w, x2 times x3. That's equal to 0. 4 times x dot 3, right? Doing the second equation now, 3 times x3 plus 0.1 times x dot 3 cubed minus 6 times x1 minus 8 was equal to 8 times u. All I've done is I've substituted in, right? All I've done is I've substituted in what I wrote down as my state variables to what I have here, right? So now what do we do? Right? Good question. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to solve each of these equations that we've come up with for the highest order differential. So what does that mean? Well, what's the highest order derivative that I have in that top equation? Yeah, it's x2 dot, right? Z double dot is x2 dot. So, all right, so I need to solve this equation right here that I'm going to mark in blue, right? I got to solve the blue equation for x2 dot, and I've got to solve the bottom one for what? X3 dot, yeah. Let me make sure that I have enough slides for this. I should have one more. I do. Perfect. So what, right? So I'm gonna take this first equation that I marked with the blue, right? So I'll just write it in blue. And I'm gonna say, well, that means that I've got x dot 2 is equal to 0.4 x1 plus 0.2 x3 minus 0.1 x2 times x3. Skip the step. Dr. G skipped a step. Let's go back to that. Let me not skip a step since we're learning this. X dot 2 is equal to z double dot, right? That's something that we know. All right, I'm going to do my algebra. It's equal to 1/2 times negative 0.8 x1 plus 0.4 x3 minus 0.2 x2 x dot 3. So you said to solve it for the highest order derivative, right? But we have an x3 dot and x2 dot, right? Well, how are we supposed to? Because the next equation is only in terms of x dot 3, so we're going to get an expression for x dot 3, right? The two things are coupled through x dot 3, right? These two things are coupled through x dot 3. So if we do the algebra out, right, we get this. What about the next one, right? X dot 3 is equal to w dot. And so this is a quarter times 8u minus 3x cubed minus 0.1x cubed. Right? Did I write that down? No, that is not. It's not that. You don't have it. Okay. So what did we just create here? Remember, 2 slides ago. We want x dot is equal to some function of all of my other inputs and all of my other state variables, right? I've created x dot is equal to all of my other state variables, x dot 2, right? There's no input in x dot 2 equation, so there's that. And I've got x dot 3 is equal to all of my inputs, which is u in this case. You can have more than one. And all of my other state variables that were applicable. Okay, question about this. It's time for everybody's favorite game show. Linear or nonlinear? Is this linear or nonlinear? Nonlinear. Because it's nonlinear, you leave it like this. You cannot put this in the state space representation. In order to put something in state space representation, these equations need to be linear. Okay. Oh, sorry, say that one more time. You can inject an observable interaction too, like key or something, whatever. But you can't write this above. Yeah, you can do stuff to. Yes. Okay. What order is this? Third, right? Third. Are we missing an equation if this is third order? Don't we need something for x dot 1? Oh, wait, sorry, are you saying which order with respect to what variable? Okay, that's overall. Oh, we got it. Right? Well, we already have our x dot 1 equation. Right here, right? Or you don't like the way that looks, x dot 1 is equal to x2. x2 is just z dot. Z dot is x dot 1, so x dot 1 is equal to x2. That's typically the way that we will see these, right? So if it's a third order system, you need one equation for x dot 1, one equation for x dot 2, and one equation for x dot 3. No. Let's see. So question was, is there a reason why this turned into 0.8 on the next page? Wait for it. Yes, the reason is that I wrote it down. And that would make this. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Why, winner? This one? Oh. Therefore, I gotta. So actually, should not be any dot here, by the way. This guy, this original equation, should not have a dot. That was a significant, no dot. Don't worry about it. That makes it look like a dot now. There's no dot. There's no dot. So not dot. No dot. Ignore that dot that I pointed out. Okay, so here's the deal. Why is the 0.4 associated with x3? Sean, that was the question, right? Okay. So z dot is x2, right? And w is x3. So this comes from here, right? I'm just remember all I'm doing is after I create these state variables, right? I'm just plugging them into my equation, right? And so I've got x3 is equal to w, and x2 is equal to z dot, right? That's why it's 0.2 x2 times x3. Okay. Any other question? All right. So let's talk about state space then. So didn't you say that we would be strictly using linear systems? Why do you only talk about nonlinear systems? As Danny pointed out, Richard Feinberg has been quoted as saying, linear systems are important because they can be solved even though they don't actually exist. And yeah, I did say that we prefer linear systems, right? For that reason, because we can solve them. But we're going to learn the trick to nonlinear, to make the nonlinear linear, right? But that's not going to be till Thursday. So we'll talk about linearization there, right? For modern complex dynamic systems, we will often encounter systems that have multiple inputs and multiple outputs, right? A MENO system as opposed to a MESO system with multiple outputs single, or multiple input single output, or a CISO system, which is the ones that we've typically been using, which is a single input, single output. There's all different flavors, right? But if the system is linear, then we can set a state variable equation in a convenient vector matrix format that we will call state space representation, right? It's extremely well suited for computer simulation, and MATLAB and Simulink handle it very nicely, right? Why? Because MATLAB loves matrices, right? It's Matrix Laboratory. That's what it stands for. That's some trivia for the day, right? Matrix Laboratory. MATLAB. State vectors. What is a state vector? Well, it is the vector of all of your state variables. Okay? So we just talked about state variables, right? You can have a state vector, right? Keeping track of all of your state variables. For a system of order n, we require n state variables in order to completely define the system. We can arrange these in a column vector. We call it the state vector. We call it x. In our textbook, they use bold for x, right? I will typically write it as x like that, right? X vector. I know there's multiple notations for vectors. Just make sure that you're using vector notation because this is a vector equation, right? It's not a physical vector like three-component force vector, but it's a convenient way of grouping our dynamic variables, right? So it doesn't give you an x, y, z vector, right? So if you try to plot it in 3 space, it'd be sloppy. It doesn't have to be restricted by 3 space, right? The order of the system doesn't preclude us from being 3-dimensional in terms of geometry. It's just how many things are we tracking, right? How many variables are important to our system. State space is the nth dimensional geometric space that contains the state vector x. Now, if you haven't had linear algebra, this is where I'm going to lose a bunch of people, right? So imagine for a second that you could graph all of the solutions to a problem in a graphical space, right? We would consider that to be a geometric space, right? So state space is, it's not geometric in the sense that it's a physical space, right? But it's a way of saying everything in this area of solutions can be grouped as a solution to my specific problem, right? That's basically the gist of what state space is, right? It's saying that everything included in this grouping belongs to my system, right? Belongs to these specific states. And I know that most of you haven't taken linear algebra. So, some of this is going to be, but I was told that you guys stayed at a Holiday Inn Express, right? So it should be good. No? Okay. Well, I was told that, legitimately told that you guys should all know how to do linear combinations of vectors and matrices, right? So, multiplying two matrices together or a vector with a matrix, right? So remember, row times column, row times column. All right, so in order to obtain a complete state space model, we first need n first order linear differential equations. Right, so if we can get a group of linear first order ODEs, right, then we can write our state space model. All right, so for example, we have this LTI third order system described by these equations. They look very similar to the equations that we just wrote, right, except these are linear. All right, so our state variable equation must have this form. So hey, look, x dot 1. It's some constant times x1 plus some constant times x2, right? Some constant times x3 plus something times my input. Right, look, that looks just like the state variable format that we had before. We're just making state variable equations, right? These state equations are linear combinations of xi and u sub j. So what does that mean? Why is that useful? Well, I want you to notice something, right? If this, I want you, let's say this, right? We're going to end up with something that looks like this. Notice, right? The group of all of my x dots, that's my x dot vector. This is equal to the linear combination of A times X, right? So A is some matrix. Let's do this in a different color. A is some matrix here that has A11, A12, A13, A21, A31, A22, A23, A32, and A33, right? That's where these come from, right? Those all get multiplied by x1, x2, and x3. Right, that's where this first portion, right, this is just A times the x vector. Plus B11, B12, B21, B22, and B31, B32 times U1 and U2. Right? So that's just all of this stuff in here, right? B times U. Okay. Remember, the major rule for matrix multiplication, right, is what? Well, vector matrix multiplication, right? Remember, m by n, an m by m matrix, right? The interior dimensions have to line up, right? So what do we have here in our example, right? Our green matrix is a 3 by 3, row by column, times a 3 by 1, right? This is going to give us what? It's going to be a 3 by 1 out. Okay. If your interior dimensions don't match up, you cannot multiply it. Hard stop. If you've ever been in MATLAB and you've been told that you have a dimension mismatch error, this is what's happening. You are not matching your dimensions properly. You are not you are trying to multiply something that cannot be multiplied. Make sure that when you're writing these equations that you have the interior dimensions, right, aligned. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything out. Okay. All right. So this is the formula that we're trying to get to, right? X dot is equal to AX plus B, but there's another portion of state space, right? Right. There's another portion of state space. So this is our state space equation, right? These are our state equations. We can also talk about our output equation. So this is important, right? So we need equations for system outputs. We can write the outputs as a linear combinations of the states and the inputs, right? So that's all well and good that I know what the inputs are and I know how they behave with my states, but what useful information can I get out? Those are my outputs, right? Notice the output equations are also a linear combination, but this time of two different matrices, C and D, right? C and D. For time invariant systems, the coefficients A, B, C, and D are constant. I want to see how we can develop, based on our models, what those coefficients are. And they're actually based on things that we know, constants that we know, different elemental equations. So the output equation looks something like this, right? I realize now, I didn't put that. Where do we get this output from, right? Where do we get this output from? Typically, we determine our outputs as some quantity that we want to measure, okay? What do I mean by that? The overall purpose, well, not the overall purpose, but one of the best uses of state space comes from when we want to create a feedback controller, right? And so we need to feed some signal back into our system, right? What does this mean, right? We'll talk a little bit about feedback control at a very high level when we get the block diagrams because you can visualize it, right? But essentially, if your car cruise control system is the system we're looking at, how does that work? Well, it reads some signal back, or it reads the speed back, feeds it back into the system, and it compares it to your set point, right? You set it at 70. If you're less than 70, you'll speed up. If you're more than 70, you'll slow down, right? We needed to make a measurement of that velocity to understand how to feed it back, right? What to do with it once it feeds back. And that's where we're kind of going with this, right? So how do we determine the outputs? Well, it could be anything, really. In all the problems that we do, since I'm not, in all the problems that we do, you will be told that what the output is and what we're trying to measure so that we can have consistency across our problems. In the real world, you should pick things that are easy for you to measure, right? All right, so we kind of went through this, right? Breaking down these matrices and these vectors, right? So what we need to do is assemble all of our variables, right? We kind of talked about X. What are we going to pick for X? X is going to typically be, not typical, we should always be using a dynamic variable as our state vectors, right? For the inputs to our state vectors. Then we have our input vector, which is our U vector, right? And then we have our output vector, which is just our vector of Y, right? And that's typically user defined. Right. The left-hand side of the state equation is the first time derivative of the state vector. So remember, x dot, right? X dot is just take the derivative of the state vector. Okay. We can talk about A, B, C, and D as well. right? So A is what we call the system or the state matrix. And B is our input matrix, right? So we multiply A by the state vector, right? So that's our state matrix. B gets multiplied by the input vector, that's our input matrix. C is our output matrix. Well, that gets multiplied by our state matrix. And D is our direct link matrix, right? What the heck? The direct link matrix tells us, is there a direct link between our output and our input, right? Is there something that our input is, that our output is doing that is directly affecting the inputs, right? Or vice versa. The input directly goes out to the output, right? And so here's the final forms of our equations, right? We talked about x dot is equal to ax plus bu. And these are the important ones. And y is equal to cx plus bu. Now, if you're going to do this in MATLAB, you need to know A, B, C, and D. If you're going to set up state space in MATLAB, in Simulink, it's going to specifically ask you for all of these matrices. So we need to figure out how we're going to come up with them, right? And we can do that. We'll do that. We'll do that. Both of these equations together constitute a complete state space representation. So if you were asked to create a state space representation of a model, you need to have both of these equations. If you don't have both of them, then you didn't do all. Okay? It's expected that we will have an x dot equation and a y equation, right? A state equation and an output equation. And we talked about inner dimensions and dimension mismatch errors. Thousands of grad students a year die because of dimension mismatch errors. Not really. It's a little bit of an exaggeration. Yeah. It's like forming a Horcrux, right? Where the little part of your soul is like ripped and torn. Right? And that can't be killed because it has so many Horcruxes, guys. Made from all of us. Pieces of all of us. Anyway. Okay. You guys have any questions on this? A lot of ideas, right? This is vector matrix representation of the models that we've already been creating. So how does this affect what we've been doing, right? Well, you're going to do everything that we've been doing. You're going to create the model the normal way that we do. And then at the end, you're going to, instead of leaving it in as an IO, as an input-output equation, you're going to define state variables and create these vector matrix equations, right? Let's try this. This looks familiar, right? We've seen this problem a few times. All right, so I've got a wall of a house composed of 3 sections that are equally sized. The wall is 6 meters tall, 5 meters wide, 3 meters thick. We want to develop a model for heat transfer from the environment to the home, including the capacitance of each section. Right? So from the environment to the home, that tells us that Q is going to be in that direction, right? We're given all of these coefficients as well. We did this model right last week, right? 1 week ago today. It's also in the homework. So what do we do? Well, first thing first, let's draw a diagram. Right? I'm going to draw this one up as my circuit representation. We got R sub H, RB over 2, going to the temperature of the brick, RB over 2, RF over 2. Right, so just splitting all of my T out, T in. Q, we were told, is flowing this way. I'm going to group these. I'm going to call this group R1, this group R2, this group R3, and this group R4. Why? Why would I do that? That's a great question. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I don't feel like writing RH and RB over 2. Right? I don't feel like writing those. So I'm going to write them as R1, R2, R3, and R4. How do I combine them? Well, they're in series. So I'm just going to add them. Right? So R1 is just RH plus RB over 2. Right? Could we assign numbers to all of them and figure that out? Sure. Sure we could. Do we need to? No, not yet. What's that? So yeah, in the, let's say include the capacitance of each section, right, in this problem. So specifically, we are told that there is a capacitance, right? There's some energy being stored by each of these, right? So what's my inputs and my outputs here, right? That's a great question. And this is going to actually fall in what we do later. My input, I'm going to call T out. My output's going to be TB, TF, and TS, right? So I know the outside and the inside temperature, right? I know what I want the inside temperature to be. I know the outside temperature. I know that there's some heat coming through the house, right? Something's happening. There's heat transfer coming into my house. It's Arizona. Make it stop. I don't want that. I want to keep that out, right? What am I supposed to do? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to track the temperature. We're going to track the temperatures of the brick, the fiberglass, and the sheetrock. Those are going to be our outputs. And from a practical standpoint, right, that should be fairly easy for us to get telemetry on, right? It should be, I mean, it's not, well, you could run a thermistor or a thermocouple inside the wall and have that wire come back out so you would know what the temperature of these sections are, right? It's not out of the range of possibility. I don't know why you want to, right? Doesn't really make a difference how much energy is being stored in the wall, right? You want to know what the inside and out, but you could. You could. Okay. So that's my inputs and my outputs. Truths. As we said before, right, we've got Newton's law of cooling and the master thermal truth, right, that for every thermal property, you should be writing it down, right? This is the simplified version that doesn't have the mass flow rates because there's no mass flow rates. So there's that. Also, I will write down R1 is equal to R sub H plus RB over 2. R2 is equal to RB over 2 plus R of F over 2. R3 is RF over 2 plus RS over 2 and R4 is RS over 2 plus RH. And that's the last time that I am ever going to write that because I'm just going to keep everything as R1 and R2. So far, so good, right? Everybody's cool. Everybody's with me. Yeah, we all good? Everybody at home okay?
Yes, sir.
Is that yes, sir, or yeah, sure?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sure, sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That is a Super Troopers reference for those of you paying attention or in the classroom. If you don't know what I'm talking about, well, you should go and find out what I'm talking about. Okay. Anyway, want to reduce this now, right? So let's start with the first node there. We've got C sub B, T dot B is equal to 1 over R1 times T out minus TB minus 1 over R2 TB minus TF. Right? And we're just going to kick this on down. We'll do this here, right? And normally we'd be cool, right? We would just leave it like this. And that would be that, right? So unfortunately today, we're not being cool, man. Not going to be cool. Today we algebra. All right, so I'm going to write this over here. I'm going to algebra this, right? By the magic of algebra, I will come up with 3 first order differential equations. But you already have 3 first. That's true, I do. It's true that I do. And I could leave it like this, right? I could just leave it like this. I could just leave it like this. And in fact, I lied. I'm not going to algebra. I am going to leave it like this. Because if we're going to state space representation, we can leave it like this. Now, the only difference being that if we don't algebra it, well, you know what? We are going to algebra. We're going to algebra it just so that we have all of the different temperature terms isolated already, so we don't have to worry about. All right. So I'm going to multiply through by all of my R1s and R2s, and I'm going to regroup so that I have everything as one T2 term, or one TB term, one T out term, right? And so if we algebra this, we get CB T dot B not equals plus 1 over R1 plus 1 over R2 times TB minus 1 over R2 T sub F is equal to 1 over R1 T out, equation 1. CF is T dot F plus 1 over R2 plus 1 over R3 T sub F minus 1 over R3 TS is equal to 1 over R2 TB. And CS T dot S plus 1 over R3 plus 1 over R4 times TS minus 1 over R3 T 1 over R4. So what order equation is this? What order system do you have? 3, right? Third order. How do we know that? Well, there's a couple ways. First, we have 3 energy storages, right? 3 energy storages for a thermal system will give us through a third order system. The other thing is look at these equations, right? I've got 3 first order differential equations describing my system, and that's the third order system. So if we have a third order system, how many state variables do I need? 3, right? Heard somebody say. It's as many as the order of the system. As many as the order of the system. So we're going to take these 3 equations, right? And first thing we're going to do is we are going to define our state variables, right? So I'm going to define them. Let's define them here. So I need 3 state variables, right? X1, X2, and x3. Well, state variables should be my dynamic variables, right? So shouldn't that just be TB, TF, and TS? The answer is yes, it should be them. Okay. Okay. Why should we use those? Because those are dynamic variables. And that's what is contributing to our energy storage. But if we look at our equations, we need x dots, right? Yeah. So I'm also going to define my inputs as T out and T inside, right? T outside and T inside. The final thing is we need to define our output variables, right? And we defined them earlier, but I'm going to give them state space. I'm going to give them state for output variables, y1, y2, and y3. And those are the equations. That's what we're going to be looking at. Remember, what are we trying to develop with the state space representation? We need to figure out the equation x dot is equal to ax plus bu, right? And the equation y is equal to cx plus du. Okay. So I'm going to rearrange these equations that we have down here, right? I'm going to rearrange equations 1, 2, and 3. And if I rearrange equations 1, 2, and 3, and I solve each one of these for the highest order derivative, right? So I'm going to solve equation 1 for t dot b. So I'll have t dot b is equal to something. I'll have t dot f is equal to something, and I'll have t dot s is equal to something. All right, so let's do that. Let's rearrange and get these like this. So t dot b is equal to -1 over c sub b r1 plus r2 times tb plus 1 over c sub b r2 tf plus 1 over c sub b r1 tx. And so I'm just doing some algebra here and combining, moving things around to solve for t dot f, t dot b, t dot f, and t dot s. Okay. Great. That's great. Right? So now what should I do? Well, now we need to input. I'll give myself another slide after this. I did, actually. Now we need to put our state variables in, right? So t dot b, that was x dot 1. X dot 1. So then sub and state variable. Where this is going to get really confusing is for translational systems when you decide to use x to describe your position. That's where this is going to get confusing because x is my state variable, right? Just be aware. Neither here nor there for right now, right? So if I'm just plugging in TB was X1, and notice I've written these in a specific way. Right? I'm going to write these in a specific way. You don't have to write them this way, but I think it makes it easier when you go to build your state space. If you're not very comfortable with matrix and vector, matrices and vectors, right? If you write this, if you write these, right, so we can do the TF equation, such that your X1's cascade and your X2's cascade, you can keep a little bit better track of where things are supposed to go. And you can keep a little bit better track of where things end up in the matrix. Minus. We don't have an X1 here. So we're just not going to write an X1. I'm just moving it over just to keep it stacked, right? So this makes it less confusing. I don't want to put a 0 in there either, because then you're going to want to put a 0 in. Well, you are going to have. Hold on. I will write it that way. All right, and I'm going to adjust this one too. Okay, so look, right, just like when we went over it on a few slides ago before this problem, right? I've got x dot 1 is equal to a11 x1 plus a12 x2 plus a13 x3, right? And then everything that's associated with an input is a b, right? So freeze this for a second. Remember, we're trying to make a x plus b. X dot is equal to a x. B times u. Okay. So x dot. X dot is the derivative of my state vector, right? This is x dot 1, x dot 2, x dot 3. This is going to be equal to my A matrix. I'm going to give myself some room, because I know my X matrix. It's x1, x2, x3. I give myself some room for my B, u1, u2. All right. So you already know x dot, you already know x, and you already know u. What do I fill in here? Well, remember, we go back, right? No, that's wrong. There we go. Did I skip? X1, X2, X3, U. Right? So this is A11, A12, A13, A21, A22, A23, A31, A32, A33, right? So I have this already set up. All I have to do is grab these coefficients and drop them right in. Right, that's all I have to do. Come on, you can do it, PowerPoint. I believe in you. Notice we do row times column, right, for linear combination. This is only, give myself too much room on that one. Row times column. So if I multiply that first row by the column vector, what do I get? I get -1 over CBR1 plus R2 times X1 plus 1 over CBR2 X2 plus 0 X3 plus 1 over CBR1 U1 plus 0 U2, which gives me back, this equation right here, right? Gives me that X dot 1 equation. So you should be able to check your matrix and make sure you get back to this equation, right? Because if you can't get back to this equation with the matrix that you wrote down, then it's wrong, right? So it has a built-in check. The method has a built-in check to it, right? What about if I do the next line, right? I'm gonna have to make this longer, I think. 1 over CF R2, -1 over CF R2 plus R3, and 1 over CF R3. And the last one is 0, 1 over CS R3 minus 1 over CS R3 plus R4. And so I realize this isn't the best looking matrix that I've ever written in my entire life, but gets the job done, right? There's no inputs on the second one. 0, 1 over CS R. If you multiply this out, you should get back to the original three equations that we started with. If you didn't, then you got to relook at what you did. The next equation that we're talking about is y is equal to cx plus du. And we said that our outputs, right, what we're interested in determining is the temperature of each of our three layers, right? So we defined those as y1, y2, and y3. Right, so we're gonna have some C matrix that's gonna get multiplied by x1, x2, and x3. And I'm gonna have some D matrix that gets multiplied by u1 and u2. Right, so again, we just have to figure out what C and D are. And how do we do that? Do we have an expression for, remember, y1 is TB, y2 is TF, and y3 is TF. We have an expression to go from y to x, right? Where does this come from? Well, I want to show you this. We're going to go back to where we defined our state variables. Well, y1 is TB, right? It's right up there in the right-hand corner of the screen. Right? Y1 is TB. What else is TB? X1. What else is Y2? What else is X3 or Y3? I said it, it's X3. All right. So Y1 is equal to X1, Y2 is equal to X2, and Y3 is equal to X3. In this case, is that always the case? No. No. In this particular one, it is. So we can rewrite, and notice none of those temperatures are directly linked to our inputs, right? So we have these in terms of our state variables already. We can plug them into our equation, right? So what's this going to look like in our vector matrix form, right? Well, it's going to look like an identity matrix once this stuff gets out of here. Right? Y1 was equal to X1. That's it. So our D matrix is 0. Our C matrix is identity. Right? And that all comes from us, the way that we've defined things. Right? That comes from the way that we've defined things. Now, overall, right? Overall speaking, D is not always going to be 0. Again, if you know all the states, remember, you can figure out energy. You can figure out, right? If you were trying to look for the potential energy of the mechanical system, you could do that here, right? Because that would just be the Y position. It would be a function. It would be 2 constants multiplied by your Y position. Okay. Sean. Because the inside temperature and the outside temperature aren't directly, there's no direct link between, right? Just because it's 50 degrees outside doesn't mean that the interior temperature of the fiberglass is going to be something, right? Okay. Okay. Danny is talking about the eigenvalues and what they mean for stability. We'll talk more about stability and stuff in the coming weeks. That's a big part about, so whether something's stable or unstable is very important, right? As you can imagine. We need to be able to discuss when a system is stable, when it is unstable. What are the conditions that make it stable? What are the conditions that make it unstable? Is it stable for certain inputs but not others, right? Why is stability important? Because if you're unstable, bad things could happen. Now, there's a whole, control systems is the human attempt to take the unstable and force it into stability, right? And I will cite the inverted pendulum problem as that. Okay? Something that is inherently unstable that you can force into stability using control systems. This is the human way of exerting their will over something. Yes. You guys have any other questions on this? Any questions at all? Correct. And that's also something that we're not, that's more of a frequency domain topic than a time domain. Yes. That's going to be like the last month of the semester, pretty much from Thanksgiving until Christmas. Well, I guess the semester doesn't end on Christmas, right? I don't want people to get scared. It is a little bit longer than normal, right? It's going to go to like the 12th or something. No, is it the 12th? It might be the 12th. I don't remember. All I know is that I have until the 23rd to get grades. So that's, there I go again, making it about me again, guys. I apologize. All right. I don't think we have time to, apparently we don't have time to switch the slides because, that was, all right. So next class, we're going to, I don't think we have enough time right now. I don't think it'd be worth it to start this because then we would just have to redo the whole thing next class. So we'll end a little early today. All right. And we'll do this next class, right? Actually, why don't we do this? For participation this week, I want you guys to try this at home. Try this problem. Okay. turn in your work. Doesn't have to be right or wrong, right? I'm not looking for correctness, right? I want to see that you tried. Try this. Send me a private forum message with your work, okay? Before the start of next class.
Thank you, Professor.
Yep. Yep, just as a private forum message with a an attachment, right? An attachment. Yeah. You guys need to grab it. You can grab it. Do you have a poll everywhere? So, you can always look on the video, right? This will be towards the end of the video, which will be up on YouTube after class. All right, Sean. Can you throw that up? I gotta bump my YouTube hits, man. I gotta get myself in that search algorithm. All right. I'll see you guys on Thursday. Pretty much. Yes. No, there's no gotcha in that regard. It's like dealing with my in-laws, right? My wife's family is very much, they love joking around. And so I don't know when they're trying to tell me a joke or when they are actually just talking and having a conversation with me. So it's like always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And like, where's the joke from? Oh, just to get a sense on the exam for whatever number that was, the pendulum one. I read out of time, so it was made for fully.
Hey, Dr. D. Hey, Dr. D.
Yep, see it.
Did you get a time or a room lined up for tomorrow?
Yeah, we'll do our normal time. Just do it in room 1235. The dynamic systems room is open.
Got you.
235.
235.
Yeah. We'll do like 9:45.
Okay, perfect. That works.
All right, cool.
All right. Thank you.
No problem.